Hey, Melanie,
Derek,
what's going on?
greetings. I live very close to the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, and just to hear the birds doing stuff this morning, I was just like mesmerized. Yeah.
Nice. And what's on your mind these days?
Hmm. To be frank, things in the news, but yeah. What's on your mind these days?
I've actually, me, I'm always thinking about this podcast and thinking about all the conversations that we've had.
I
In
appreciate
part because, well, in part because we have so many amazing conversations,
you.
and I'm always curious to see how where the next guest will take us and take the sort of the topics. But because of some of the last recordings that we did, including the one on moving overseas, Blacksit. And
Hmm.
so, of course, I think as part of that conversation, well, at least as part of the prep for that conversation, we were talking about Josephine Baker, we were talking about Ralph Ellison, and some of the Black folks who moved overseas to Europe.
Hmm.
Yeah, James Baldwin, Langston Hughes.
Hmm.
Yeah, part of me was thinking about this conversation and how it's been 100 years
Oh, yeah.
since we had since that happened for some of them. James
Really
Baldwin
cool.
was a little bit later. You know, the Langston Hughes was around 100 years ago when he went over to Europe.
Yeah.
And at the same time, is when we had the Great Migration. And granted, the Great Migration was over a longer span of time, but the two of them sort of were happening simultaneously. And I've known that for a while because it's something I studied in college, but I always forget because we tend to talk about each of those somewhat separately. And it's not until, you start talking about Zora Neale Hurston
Yeah.
and her work in Florida, or Langston Hughes and him seeing people coming up from the South and arriving in Harlem. It's not until you get to those points that you're like, oh, right, they did happen simultaneously. And so part of me was thinking about, this episode, thinking about the podcast generally, and thinking about power, because, we're talking about Black power, land, and wealth, and this power of imagery.
Mm.
And so, I kind of was thinking about, there's a lot of imagery that's associated with two of those. And they happen simultaneously, but we rarely talk about them at the same time.
Yeah.
And so, just in preparation for this conversation, I pulled two images. Let me just pull them up real quickly. These two images, and these are not the total summation of either the Harlem Renaissance or the Great Migration. They're just sort of examples. But on the left, we have these three women. And for those of you who are just listening and not watching, there's an image here of three women from the Harlem Renaissance on the left, probably in their Sunday best. Maybe they went to a jazz club. They're wearing furs and very fine clothes. And on the right, this picture of a family that's probably also in some of their best clothing. There's a woman wearing a pearl necklace and they're wearing these hats. But they're not as fine, they're not as elegant. They're more like traveling clothes than they are for just going out and showing off clothes. And just the power of these images, I think, is pretty potent because I think I would guess that the picture on the left of the Harlem Renaissance was taken by a Black person of other Black people. And the picture on the right, I don't know. I
Hmm.
don't know if it is, if it was, but both of those still have a power to them that I think is important to recognize because they both tell narratives
Yeah.
and tell stories about the Black community or the various Black communities at the time. And sort of these two are both sort of the different branches of where Black America has sort of gone since this time.
Hmm. Yeah, I see so much in these images juxtaposed as well, noting in particular that the women in that roaring 20s Renaissance image are fair skinned. They seem to represent a certain kind of class attainment, such that they're showing off a certain kind of fashion. But also want to remember that uh, what what populated Harlem in many ways was people leaving the South. So there was a trajectory. It wasn't just simultaneous. People were flooding into these cities, and um, that what we come to know as Harlem happened because so many people were fleeing. And so it's just interesting to see the class distinctions between these two images and
Mhm.
it's kind of escape. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So just, a thought that I was having, or thoughts that I have been having, um, Well, just in general, because again, it's about 100 years. And just a few years ago, we were talking about the 100th anniversary of Greenwood.
Hmm.
And so, just add a couple more years, we're solidly in the middle of what was the Harlem Renaissance and the Great Migration. So just thoughts I was having in preparation for this episode, but also just in general. Yeah. But yeah, so let's move on and bring on our guests, because I think our guests will have some things to say. And I'm curious to hear what those are.
Yeah, I'm interested and excited about today's guest too, who comes at this from a historic and academic perspective, thinking about, well, what was it like to be on the ground, not just building community, but building buildings at that time in the early 1900s, both in the North and the South. Very excited to bring on Jay Cephas today. Let's tell you a little bit about Jay, who is a historian of architecture, landscapes, and cities, whose research analyzes both ordinary and critical spatial practices to recover the knowledges that are transmitted through the bodies and buildings of urban environments. Jay is founding director of Studio Platt, a geospatial research practice, and the director of Black Architects Archive, which we're going to learn about today, an interactive repository that documents the work of Black architects, builders, contractors, and other built environment practitioners working across the 19th and 20th centuries. Jay is currently an assistant professor in the history and theory of architecture at Princeton University. He previously taught at Harvard University, University of Michigan, Northeastern University, and University of Detroit Mercy. Delighted to bring you on, Jay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thanks for joining us. How's it going with you today?
Pretty good. It's a good day.
Nice. So we know that you deal with, as part of what Melody mentioned, and part of what we know that you'll be showing us, is that you deal with imagery, archival imagery, historic imagery that tells the story of people and buildings and processes that are, I won't say they're lost to history, but that most people don't know. So, we started off with our banter talking about those two images from the Harlem Renaissance and the Great Migration. Do you see any connections, or do you have any thoughts on those?
Yeah. Well, I'm really interested in thinking about the origins of those images, which you were sort of touching on. The one on that was on the right of the family looking like they were traveling. They have their suitcases there, potentially wearing their traveling clothes. Um, I don't know where this image was taken, but it makes me think of the conditions in these railway stations that these Black people passed through during the Great Migration, where Black people were often sequestered in the rail stations. They had these specialized rooms in the basements to check to see whether they had vaccine scars for smallpox. And this was a very traumatizing experience because they were often stripped naked and inspected by these white inspectors to see if they had been vaccinated. And they were forced to go through that process before they could leave the train station and enter into northern cities. And photographing them was a part of documenting the fact that they had gone through that process. Yeah. So I don't know if that's where this photograph is from, but that's what it makes me think of too, right? All of the sort of layers that go into not just the sort of the travel and the transmission that people are going through, but even just the conditions of the photograph being taken. And so that's something that I see here that I find very interesting, that the condition of those women in Harlem on the left, the condition behind the taking of the photograph seems quite different than potentially what the condition behind the taking of the photograph on the right is as well.
That is a great insight. I don't think I ever knew that people were checked for their vaccination status at the train stations. And that picture of that family was taken, it says migrants in Chicago when I was just looking at that. So I don't know if they were taken, if those vaccination checks were done before they got on the train or even after they got off the trains in the northern cities.
Yeah. So it's very possible that photograph is part of those records, those sort of vaccination records, where they would kind of photograph an entire group or family as proof that they had kind of gone through the process. And then that sort of leaves the photograph also as kind of evidence of the real difficulties that people had to go through just to get into the city itself. And that's even aside from having to pack all their belongings and all the things that you go through, with just moving from one place to another.
And also moving in secrecy, right? I mean, having to leave, my understanding at least, is for a lot of people who were escaping the South, they were leaving often under the cover of darkness. If they were leaving kind of sharecropping jobs, that they had to leave in secret. So a lot of stress and duress.
Yeah. I did some research a few years ago about this sort of really interesting condition where so many Black people were leaving, and a lot of the white landowners were trying to prevent them from doing that. And they would do things like have these sort of full page spreads in newspapers, kind of warning against Blacks moving to the North, and the sort of advertisements would do things like talk about how cold it was in the North and how expensive things were, and how the North wouldn't be as welcoming as the South was, unbelievably. But that's sort of what was kind of put out there. So a lot of times people leaving under the cover of night, I mean, sometimes it was directly in relation to racial violence, but often it was simply about evading that pressure to stay, right? And really being able to have to go to great lengths to even just say to the landowners, like, no, we're going, we're leaving, and we're not coming back.
Right. But let's widen the lens a little bit, because Black people in the 1920s weren't just hanging out in Harlem wearing the finest clothing, nor were they only getting on trains and trying to escape from the South and moving to the North. They were doing other things. They were constructing things. They were building things, which is part of what why we wanted to talk to you about what Black folks were doing in terms of actually building and constructing buildings and other things around the country. So can you give us just a quick rundown in terms of how you got started looking into that history?
Yeah. So I got started looking into that history because years ago, when I first started studying architecture and urban planning, one of the things that was repeated quite a bit in sort of learning the history of architecture was that there were no Black architects, or there were no Black people involved in these areas. And I knew that that was wrong because I knew that slaves did everything. And so I knew at the very least that there were enslaved builders who engaged in building practices. And so then that's the trajectory that I trace and I'm really interested in are the enslaved builders who developed a whole range of skilled trades in the building practices. So they were carpenters, they were masons, they were blacksmiths. Um, and then as those slaves were either emancipated or their children were, they kept those building practices and parlayed that into careers. And this is like in the mid 1800s, towards the late 19th century. They parlayed that into careers as builders, as contractors, as real estate developers, all kinds of different ways of working with building practices and with land. And then those same people kind of became the nodes of essentially professional networks among Black folks who were, because of racialized systems, were excluded from the dominant professional practices. So they created these sort of networks among themselves that kind of sustained their building practices right through the 20th century. So there really is this almost through line that you can trace from these enslaved builders to these builders who establish their practices right after emancipation, right through to mid 20th century architecture firms, construction firms, real estate developers, who some of these individuals, you look through their family history and they've been builders all the way going back in some cases.
And can you highlight examples of like locations? Like, I just like to try to map this in my mind. Like, where in the country? I mean, was this primarily in the South? Was this all around the United States? So a lot of this started during Reconstruction. It sounds like right out of the gate.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, it occurs in lots of different places for different reasons. So in the South, in places like South Carolina, that had, one of the largest concentrations of enslaved labor during
Yeah.
slavery, you have these sort of smaller towns in South Carolina, North Carolina, where there's like lots of these Black builders who are building churches, building schools, building houses, and especially right during Reconstruction, there's a need for Black people to literally build their own communities, right? So this work is necessary
Yes.
because if Black people are going to be educated, then they have to build their own schools. If they want to
Yes.
worship, they have to build their own churches, they have to build their own houses. So you had pockets of that in these small towns all throughout the South. You start to see some aggregations in particular places, Washington, D.C. being the most notable one, right? So Washington, D.C. has had a significant Black population going all the way back to when that area was first settled by white settlers. And so Washington, D.C. becomes the place where lots of Black people from the South, from further South, move to Washington, D.C. And it really sort of establishes a Black middle class very early on.
Mm.
By the 1870s or so. And it's that Black middle class then who are able to pay for Black builders to build churches, schools, homes, to establish schools, to turn what were earlier normal schools and industrial institutes into what became the HBCUs. So Howard University kind of comes out of this. And then Howard University establishes the architecture program, right? And then begins to train. So Washington, D.C. is a particular concentration. Through my research, I have about 600 or 700 buildings in Washington, D.C. that were built by Black builders. And that's, I'm sure, just like a fraction, right? That I'm still kind of finding more and more. But then you have other places like Rochester, New York, where there were Black builders who got established there around the turn of the 20th century. And through a similar process, as you see in Washington, D.C., really once you have a couple of people who were there, right, then often their sons and their daughters get involved in the business as well, right? And then they might even train their cousins or their young neighbors. And it starts as a familial practice that becomes a sort of neighborly network that becomes a professional network, and it grows out from there. So Rochester, New York ends up having this kind of huge concentration of Black builders. Los Angeles is another one where one architect in particular, Paul Williams, went there, established his practice, made lots of inroads into building houses in particular for wealthy white people in Hollywood, especially wealthy Jewish people in Hollywood who were, because at the time they were similarly excluded in certain ways, went to Black builders, right? And then that meant that other Black builders and architects started going to Los Angeles, worked with Paul Williams, or he vouched for them in other places. And so then you have this sort of concentration there as well. So those are some of the bigger places, but it's really spread throughout the United States, where you have what begin as kind of like these familial or sort of close relationship networks that eventually, in a generation or two, become these established professional networks that allow people to do the things that they need to do precisely because they're excluded from the kind of larger professional networks.
Mm.
Can we go back a second? So you said that when you were in architecture school, you were told, or maybe it was suggested, that there were no Black architects. But given what you described, given what you already knew, that people who were slaves or formerly slaves had to build their own buildings and build their own towns, you can't have been the only person in the entire country to have thought that. And so there must have been other people who were thinking this too. So my question is, how did the architecture community get away with such willful lack of knowledge, such willful forgetting of these Black architects for so long, given the richness of what you just described in the past 5 minutes?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of reasons for that. One reason is that forgetting that you put in air quotes is not really in air quotes, right? I mean, there really is an intentional forgetting, maybe not when I was in architecture school, but if that forgetting begins, say, immediately post emancipation, like once something is not put in the historical record, there's little reason for people later to realize that it's not there. And I think in my case that was certainly what was happening, is that I was taught by people who just did not know. But then the other side of this, which I find really interesting, is recently I was in conversations with several people who were professors at HBCUs going back to like the 1950s or so, or who were educated in the HBCUs. And one in particular, Melvin Mitchell, who wrote this really great book about Black architects, which I read when I was in architecture school. And that was an important thing for me to read to sort of confirm my suspicions about things. He talked about how when he was educated, and I have to say, I can't remember which HBCU he went to, but when he was educated, it never occurred to him that there weren't Black architects, because he was in an architecture school where all of his professors were Black and all of the buildings on the campus were built by Black people. And that was just sort of clear to him. And so anyway, he and I had an interesting conversation about these sort of parallel histories, right? Depending on where one is educated or where one lives, what kind of knowledge the people around them have. That because I was educated in predominantly white institutions, the knowledge sort of train really follows whatever has been written into sort of dominant historical records. And extra work on the part of someone like me would have to be done to find out information otherwise. Whereas someone like Melvin, who was educated within HBCUs, that was just a given from the very beginning, right? Because the way he described it is that he saw it all around him. He was surrounded by buildings built by Black people. And so it wasn't ever a question to him
And that
whether that was historical true. Yeah,
Right.
and that he knew it. Exactly.
by Black people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And is the architecture, I feel like I'm going to stray a little bit with this question, so I won't go further, but is the architecture community trying to resolve this? Are they trying to remedy this by bringing Black people and their work back into the common body of architectural knowledge and architectural history?
Yeah, so I do think that there's an interest in doing that from different people and different places. Certainly from Black people involved in architecture, right? So there's sort of an interest around that as a way of really sort of understanding both the expanse of Black building practices and Black people's involvement with shaping the built environment. And then also understanding, for me in particular, and I know for some others as well, the way in which then practices around architecture, around land, and around real estate historically have really done a lot of work to suppress that history, right? So it's not that we just don't know it because we happen to just not know it, right? But that there have been efforts to suppress it. So what does it mean to also understand that history as well, right? To understand the history of our disciplines, right, or the histories of our professional work networks that have worked in these exclusionary ways, right? I personally think it's important to understand that history, because if we understand the ways in which our professional networks worked in exclusionary ways, then we can also understand how some of those exclusions persist and what we might do to reverse them or undo them, right? And so for me, that understanding that history becomes very important to making changes in the present and for the future moving forward.
Mm-hmm. I'm excited about, when you first talked with us, Jay, about your archive. Like you're speaking of record, you have a way that people can actually research and look at buildings or locations of buildings that were constructed by Black people. And part of it is we see this with a kind of sense of awe. Like you're talking about the mid and late 1800s, where Black people are constructing massive structures of their own volition for their communities against all kinds of economic odds. So I'm interested for you to showcase some of what that looked like.
Yeah. So similar to what I was just saying about Melvin Mitchell's commentary about the buildings on his HBCU being built by Black architects, it was before the early HBCUs, and even before they kind of got that designation, they were called normal schools, industrial institutes. Um, and even before they had schools of architecture necessarily, in order for the school to exist, they needed to make the buildings. And I have an image here showing students at Tuskegee building one of the buildings there, right? You can see what I think is at least one of the instructors, maybe it's two instructors. They look like slightly older men who are looking at the drawings there, and the students there are building the roof for the structure. And I don't know how many, but my understanding is most, or at least many of the buildings at Tuskegee were built by students who were being instructed in different building trade schools, also in architectural drawing and engineering along the way. And so the building practices at Tuskegee have been really well documented, so that there's these photographs of it, there's all these sort of journals and notebooks around it. Although my understanding is that this was common at other schools as well. You know, on the one hand, it's a great, of course, learning opportunity for the students, but on the other hand, this was just the only way it was going to get done, right? That there wasn't some kind of outside kind of contractor or group of builders that they could bring in to do this, that if they were going to create this space for themselves, that they needed to design it and build it for themselves. And then that's exactly what they did. Another example is that by the 1880s or so, the American Institute of Architects had been created and had made it their mission, and it was a predominantly white association, to really restrict who could call themselves an architect. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. The most predominant reason was about really setting aside the most valuable work for themselves, essentially. And so when that happened, it meant that a lot of these Black builders could no longer call themselves architects, even though they had been for a long time. And so they started to create other kinds of institutions or associations. And one of those was one called the Negro Contractors Conference. And I have an image here showing the people who attended that conference. I can't remember exactly what year this was, but it was in the 19 teens, I think. Maybe the early 20s.
So put on the image, it was 1928.
Okay, 1928. So there's a group here who were the attendees of the Negro Contractors Conference. In the middle is Ethel Madison Bailey Furman, who was, I believe, the only woman to attend it that year. And she is surrounded by Black men who were all architects, builders, contractors. They were not allowed to call themselves architects by this point unless they had gone through the processes set forth by the American Institute of Architects that would have allowed them to call themselves that. But anyway, they formed their own association that allowed them to come together, to network, to exchange ideas, to develop building projects, or what have you. I really love this image, and I feel like every time I look at it, I sort of see more in it, or sort of more to think about. There's something very stately about it in ways. I can never decide if Ethel Furman sitting in the center looks sort of diminutive in relation to them or protected in relation to them. There's this sort of tension there to me between what her sort of role is here, and I don't want to project at all kind of my understanding onto her, but it's really captivating. I find it to be a very kind of captivating image. The other thing I find really interesting about this image and the images and names that I have listed in the Black Architects Archive is that all of these kinds of things really serve as of evidence of how many people were doing this, right? As opposed to, oh, you know, there's sort of one person we know about here in this year, or this person over there in that year, right? But engaging in building practices, building community, literally building community, was widespread, right? And that lots of different people engaged in it in different ways.
Yeah. And just sort of linking maybe this is a link I should make, but linking the Harlem Renaissance picture where Melody mentioned that the three women were very light skinned. with the 1928 Negro conference, I'll put the image back up. I was saying before we started the show, I was asking who are the four white guys in the back, and you were saying these are all black people, but some of them were passing. And again, just in terms of popular imagination, there's that book Quicksand and Passing. I forget who wrote that book, but then there's also the movie Passing that happened recently, where it shows black people who are white presenting, who can pass, tend to, and they do, in order to escape having to be subjected to the discrimination, the racism, the exclusion. And so I find it interesting that that these four men here are white, and then two, they chose to stay involved in this organization and in this conference and supporting it. So I don't know if there's anything more you could add to that, but
Yeah. So I've come across quite a few white passing Black folks in this sort of process of amassing the Black Architects Archive and sort of looking through this material. I think I have to say I don't want to say too much because I don't know enough about the history of it, but my understanding is that what we see as white passing today would not necessarily have been seen as white passing then, and that some of the measures of the ways in which I would say dominant society decided who was black and white, like people were just looking way more closely at that stuff than they do now. And I say that because in some ways, absolutely, some of these white passing people do and can pass. But I think a lot of them actually can't, right? And part of it is about these networks that people sort of rely on, right? That it's really hard, much harder than it is today, to just go somewhere else and not know anyone and sort of insert yourself into something completely new. So if someone is connected to these Black professional networks or social networks, definitely if they're connected to Black familial networks, they're Black, right? And it doesn't matter like how white passing they are. Like once they have that connection to something, that's the way that they're sort of seen and understood by the sort of larger society. And so that's something that I find also very interesting too. But there were definitely quite a few white passing folks involved in these networks.
Yeah, that makes great
super
sense.
interesting.
Yeah. One of the things that stands out to me is so much of what we're talking about is Black people's relationship with the land then. That the only way they could build institutions was to claim land, build something on it. And we're talking about how, looking back, we're kind of impressed, encouraged to see that there were Black people taking all of this initiative in all of these places and all these ways in building a craft, building a trade, building a network. And then I think about now, and it's not that easy to access land to build something. So it's almost like we've done some kind of reversal because of exclusionary laws, zoning, access to capital, all the rest. We don't have that kind of ability to take that kind of initiative now, frankly. It's almost like by default, that's the only way people could establish some kind of stability, was to use land. And now, how can we actually get land that we own?
Yeah, I mean, I think things are just way more difficult now. The barriers are much higher. I don't, I guess I don't see it as a matter of a lack of initiative necessarily.
Oh, definitely not. That's my point, is that
Yeah.
you could take the initiative. It's almost like the ability to even take the initiative has been removed now. Well, maybe initiative is not the word, but it's like, as much as you have that drive, frankly, how do you get access to land? Back then, what they had was land that someone else didn't want. They could claim it. Even if it was the side of town that white people didn't want to be on, it was a side of town you could do something in. That's harder to do now.
But I think what we value has changed too.
Yeah.
Because between these images were from the 1920s. So the Harlem Renaissance one was from 25. The migrants are from 20. The Negro Conference was from 1928, from the 20s. Between then and now, we had the GI Bill, which drove suburbanization,
Yes.
and then we've had the creation of the American dream.
Yes.
The white picket fence and the 2.5 kids and the dog and all that. And then fast forward to the 80s and 90s, where it's all about or even now, returning to the cities,
Yeah.
being in a high rise, really concentrating your wealth. So land is valued. The idea of owning and ownership and land is different now. So I don't know if there's really an easy comparison between now and 100 years ago, because just what we value as a society is totally different.
But that's not incidental, is my point.
Mm.
So it's like white people Black people, frankly, are written out of the equation of being able to actually claim, to make the choice, to say, oh, I want to be in the suburbs, or I want to be back in the city, or I want to have not had to leave the city. That's all I'm getting at, is that at least back then, folks could had some self-determination in a certain way, even in the face of all the laws that would come, Black codes and Jim Crow and all the rest. They could have a place. And I think that that's harder and harder to claim now. I really do. I just, it's not just about high rises. It's about proximity to whatever the concentration of wealth is. Sometimes that's about public transportation. Sometimes that's about jobs. But it's almost like that agency is stripped from Black people from being able to even own things in the neighborhoods where they're economically concentrated. So to me, I'm trying to wrap my brain around. Back then, people did this almost unthinkable thing that you couldn't even envision, which was they just made something happen without there being any roadmap for them, which is we're going to build structures to learn in. Mm-hmm. How do you do that now? How do you have that self-determination as it relates to the land as Black people now? And I know that, Jay, you studied labor as well. It's just a thing that it's my brain. I can't not square the two things. I can't not think about that relationship to land being different than, and I don't think it's just that values have changed. It's that we've been systematically written out of being able to actually leverage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Melanie, I think what you're saying about claim, like you've said the word claim a few times, and I think that's really key. That ownership in the United States and in sort of our kind of economic system, ownership is about making a claim to something. And if Black people have been under a system that consistently denies them the ability to make claim even to themselves, which is what underscored slavery, then the ability to make claim to other things becomes increasingly harder over time. And I think that part of what's changed over the last 100 years has been, once emancipation sort of happens and Black people are allowed to make claim to themselves, barriers are set up that prevent Black people from making claim to other things outside of themselves. And so then that's sort of what happens in that period from the 1860s through the 1920s and 30s, right? That these Black people who are making claim to sort of land and different kinds of conditions and building things, those barriers are being set up in opposition to them. So in a lot of ways, they're doing this before those barriers are actually quite there yet, right? So that they're operating in a place where they have nothing, right? They begin with nothing, but they're also are not sort of working against some big set of walls in front of them either. So I think that's one big thing. The other big thing too is that in the late 19th century in particular, there's just really this sort of culture of claiming land and of Western expansion as part of the continuation and essentially the culmination of the expropriation of land from indigenous populations. One of the things that is also interesting that I'm looking into is the way in which Black labor was deployed towards that, right? So, before emancipation, Black slaves were used and sort of taken westward as part of this kind of Westernist kind of expansion. Now, even in places that are like towns and cities for instance, on the eastern half of the United States, where the indigenous removal has happened, and by the late 19th century, and there has been white settlers there for a long time, even though claiming there is not about indigenous removal in that moment, say the 1880s in sort of North Carolina, there is very much a culture about almost like an American imperative to claim land and build, right? And so I would say that part of what's shifted since then is that that culture now is about, the so-called American dream about being able to buy a house in the suburbs, and exactly what you're saying, Melanie, right? About everything that sort of prohibits Black people in particular from being able to attain that. But I do think that in terms of maybe sort of what underlies even sort of buying the house, right? The ability to amass land.
Yes.
That there were definitely conditions in that moment that really both did not set up the kind of barriers that there are today, and that also were sort of grounded in indigenous erasure, right? That were about kind of putting forth this narrative that understood claiming land as a birthright, almost. Right?
Yeah. And then it gets codified too. Like zoning helps you codify that. Just deeds help you codify this thing that you're claiming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I do think that there is a lot to learn and be inspired by. I feel like I'm inspired by just even understanding the ways in which people with literally nothing are able to build something up, right? One of the examples that I found particularly inspiring was the building of schools. I read this report from 1868 where as part of the Freedmen's Bureau, there are these teachers who are going out to all of these sort of tiny towns and hamlets throughout the South, teaching Black people to read. And one teacher wrote this report back where she's talking about how the school in this hamlet was nothing but a few boards laid on the ground, some bricks piled up to be columns, and a roof set upon it. But the way she describes it, it's clear that she sees this as being incredibly resourceful, right? Because Charleston had been destroyed during the war. And so people went and took the bricks from the destroyed building and just started like placing things down, right? And these were the sort of seeds. This was sort of the very beginning of people at the very beginning just saying, we're going to mark out this place. Then eventually, some of those newly freed slaves who have skills are able to sort of come along and kind of, fix things up and make things more permanent, right? Till eventually they're able to build a school that is a solid structure that people can learn in. And so even though our conditions today are quite different, and there's a lot of different things that we have to contend with now, I do think that there is still something to learn and to be inspired by, to think about people sort of coming into this sort of newly, quote unquote, free world and being able to use the resources that they literally find lying around them, right? And to sort of put those to task to build the places that they need.
I really love that idea of literally taking things that are just on the ground around you and using them to just build your home, build your school, build your church, build your community. I wish it were that easy these days. But I really do appreciate the fact that those folks were able to do that and able to build this legacy that JAU and other folks are uncovering and providing for the rest of us to learn about and to read about. And I know that there is the archive. I think you mentioned the archive earlier. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Black Architects Archive is a collection of Black builders, architects, contractors, draftsmen and women, map makers, all manner of people who are involved in some way in shaping the built environment as a livelihood. So whether or not they were paid for it, something that these are people who engage with it as a living. So it looks at people from across the 19th and 20th century as a way to really emphasize the expanse of it. One thing that's really important for me is to really emphasize the expansiveness of Black talent and of Black skill, so that this is not about sort of isolating one or two or even a dozen people here and there who are, seen as kind of extraordinary geniuses, but to really celebrate the ordinary,
Yes.
and to sort of understand the range of skills, the range of talent, the range of possibility, and to really understand Black sort of intervention in the built environment as being multiple and expansive. I included an image of the map of Washington, D.C., which to me is always the one that's most compelling for me to see how many buildings were built in Washington, D.C. alone. And again, this is incomplete because I'm always adding more to it, by these Black builders. And most of these, I would say, were like 1880s to 1930s or so.
Architecture, my favorite era of art. Yeah.
The orange dots are buildings that are still standing. The red dots are buildings that are demolished, right? So you see these sort of clusters of areas where, for instance, these Black middle and upper class middle neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. were basically raised in the 1930s to build the federal district. So even this kind of visualization of these Black builders and the work that they did, for me, really also gets into making visible these sort of underlying histories of things like gentrification and erasure, but also things like these sort of clusters of Black neighborhoods, right? And kind of understanding that over time. So the archive is a collection of information about these Black builders and Black building practices, but it's also a visualization of that collection, right? So that we can really sort of see where these things were happening.
Including bridges. You had mentioned this bridge builder, Horace King.
Yeah. Horace King's story is pretty amazing. And, one of the things I write about is the most amazing thing might be the fact that we know about him, right? So that he didn't sort of fall to this kind of erasure of history, because I'm positive that he's not the only one.
Yeah.
But Horace King was born in 1807. He started building bridges when he was a teenager, or got involved in building practices. The first documentation of him at a bridge site is when he's like 17 or 18 or something like that.
And he had been enslaved, right? I don't know.
He was born, yes. So he was born enslaved, and was bought by a white man who was a building contractor, and he took Horace King and his mother to Georgia, where there Horace King built every bridge crossing the Chattahoochee River, which separates Georgia from Alabama. And it was renowned. Everybody knew him as the great bridge builder. He was emancipated in 1848. And then, so after that, set up this bridge building company. His 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl, ended up taking over the company after he died. They all became bridge builders, engineers as well. Horace King also served in the Alabama state legislature for 4 years. And so, so he had this really great career as a builder. But again, to me, one of the most amazing things is the fact that we know about it. And in the things written about him, there are references made to the hundreds of other Black builders, for whom we have no names, right? And so he was definitely understood as being particularly good at this, but also recognized as not being the only one, right? And that's the part that I'm interested in particular, how he was part of this sort of larger community, if we can call it that, of these Black builders, Black people who were sort of shaping land. And for me, he's also this kind of key figure, kind of linking those enslaved builders to then ones who end up building these businesses and kind of servicing their own communities following emancipation.
And if watchers and listeners want to look at the archive, what's the website they should go to?
So it's blackarchitectsarchive.org.
Good. And it's free to use. There's no subscription, no membership needed.
Nope, totally free and open for anyone to access.
Great. That sounds perfect. I know I'll be checking it out. I'm sure Melanie, you will be too at some point.
Yep.
And I hope more of our followers do as well. Well, Jay, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for walking us through all that history and all that content. Clearly, there's so much more that you could tell us about. But maybe we'll have you on again in the future so you can tell us a little bit more. Maybe you discover something new or someone new, and you get to share that discovery with us.
Great. It's been a great conversation. Thanks again.
Derek, before you stop recording, can I do a Melanie thing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I also have in my notes this thing about builders working 24/7 to build this Gothic church. And I'm like, I don't know if that's worth mentioning, but to me, that's pretty freaking exciting. I don't know where the church was, but it's in my notes from our first conversation. I had the word choreography written down. The choreography of building a Gothic church. Does that ring a bell, Jay?
Yeah. One of the more well-documented building practices are the building of churches, because churches keep their own records. Black churches in particular keep their records very, very well. And they can tell you, going all the way back to the 1860s, when their church was first founded and who founded it. And so in one of those records, I found they discuss how their church building was built. And this, I want to say, was in 1868 or 1869, around then, where they created sort of round-the-clock shifts where the men would lay the bricks for this church during the day. The women would cook for them, would get materials, would make sure supplies would set up, would sort of restock supplies. And they did this round the clock for several years until they got this building built. And wasn't sort of a small shack, but it was a substantial kind of Gothic style church. And this is kind of an example of the ways in which they use sort of every resource at hand and sort of came together as a community to build their own structures. And you see this with churches in particular, or at least it's well documented with churches. So that's kind of how we know that it happens, because the churches kind of write about it and keep it there. But it also becomes important because, despite the tenets of Christianity, Black people were not allowed to worship in white churches. So building a church building became particularly important to sort of establish and kind of assert their own humanity, right? Their sort of ability to create this place in which they were going to worship, to put a lot of resources into it, and to literally construct it with their own hands, right? So it's like those parishioners at the church are the ones who were building it.
My goodness. Where is that church, this Gothic church that was built?
So I should have looked that up before coming on, so I can't remember the exact location for this one.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. All right.
Okay. Okay, let me do the close one more time. Okay. So those of you who are watching, thank you again for tuning in. We hope you will like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you the next time on the Black Lining Forum. Take care.